think it's gonna fit.
Oh yeah, well, come on, up. Yes. Here we go. Pivot. 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 Pivot.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
So, for those that don't know, that's a clip from Friends. And while most of that show is not held up, I do think it captures both the pains of moving in New York, which I've just done for the 5th time in 7 years, and also the pains of pivoting in your career, which is what I'll be talking about today. My name is Malcolm, and I recently completed my own pivot into product management and will be sharing the various methods I employed over time to do so. By trade, I'm a classically trained actor who joined the space of arts performance, pivoted into writing, directing, and acting coaching while also moving from theater to film. And more professionally, I have journeyed through the arts administration, education, and hospitality sectors to arrive where I'm at now in user research. All of this I do through a lens of inclusion, and it is my hope to leverage both the arts and technology to build a more inclusive world through collective action and community. So without any further ado, grab your evening, afternoon, or in my case, morning, cup of coffee, and let's get this conversation started by first discussing your personal pitch. A question. How many facts about me can you remember from what I just said? I'll give you a few seconds to think to yourself. Maybe you can jot them down if that's helpful. All right. Do you have 3 to 5 facts in your head or written down? If you have fewer than that, I haven't pitched myself very well. And if you have more, I've done better than I could have hoped. A year into my first job, I famously gave a literal elevator pitch to the CEO to bankroll a Cinco de Mayo celebration. At the time, I was working for an arts administration nonprofit SaaS company. That's a lot to take in, I know. But the point is that we built SaaS products for our users to produce their work. We had a number of Mexican and Mexican-American artists fundraising and producing work using our tools. And so my pitch was that this was a fun way to educate our staff on the history of Cinco de Mayo and the Battle of Puebla, while also providing a direct link to the work we were doing by highlighting Mexican and Mexican-American artists using our software, thereby building greater staff-wide stakeholdership, connecting our work directly to the people we were serving. And I also famously love both tacos and margaritas. I had 10 short floors to pitch this, and when the doors opened on our floor, I had conditional approval pending a review of a proposal, which I had already drafted. Your self-pitch should go the same way, regardless of whether or not you're in an actual elevator. What you are aiming to communicate is who you are, what you do, and why you do it. I always prefer to speak things into existence, but I do acknowledge that a framework you may want to use, depending on your situation, is who you are, what you want to do, and why you want to do it. A final point you might also want to communicate is how you do it or how you want to do it. You should at any given time be able to speak on yourself using about 3 to 5 major keys or key points while tailoring those points to your audience. As you can imagine, the equivalent of having a proposal ready is having a matching resume ready, which we'll talk about now. I want to call out here that I won't be going over resume building, as it is often called, since I am working from an assumption of you, as viewers, already having built one to apply to roles in the past, acknowledging that some of you may not be working currently for myriad reasons. What I will be discussing is how to take that resume's foundation and make it work for you, especially in tandem with your self-pitch. Here we have 2 versions of my current resume. On the left is the topmost page of a 7-page resume that includes my entire work history. And on the right is my current product manager resume, which I would be comfortable sending to anyone at a moment's notice, and which generally highlights past work that is most relevant to product management. I know the photos are super small, so don't worry about reading the text. The point I want to communicate is that the entire page on the left is distilled into the first 6 bullets only on the right. In this distillation, I've pulled out the things I've done and accomplished that are most relevant to product management specifically. And I've also made sure to include product management specific keywords in place of other terms wherever I could. For example, I use the phrase to define product requirements rather than the phrase to determine product needs. Because while they essentially mean the same thing, the product community uses the first phrase relatively ubiquitously. A quick pro tip about most applicant tracking systems, otherwise known as ATSs. Similar to how search engine optimization or SEO works, not only do they read for exact word and sometimes phrase matching, but they also read against the use count. Meaning, if a job description lists analyze twice and perform data analysis 3 times, your resume needs to do the same in order to get the full amount of percentage match points available and to maximize the chances of your resume not being screened out by the majority of systems before an actual human reads it. Because most job descriptions are written in the future tense, this means you will have to work particularly diligently and creatively to rework your descriptions of past work for keyword optimization. This said, there are certain ATSs that specifically require human review. An example of this is the Greenhouse ATS. If you see a job board with greenhouse.io in the URL, you can safely assume you have less work to do in optimizing your resume. For those with a close eye and good memory, you'll also see that my resume's headline is the same headline as I used in this presentation. And you'll also see that this presentation uses the same color story and font as my resume. As I mentioned, I am a person that likes speaking things into existence. So I'd like to also note that I was using this headline and calling myself a product manager well before I was in the role I am in now, which is technically the first time I've held the title. In this sense, I crafted my brand identity, which I also carry over to my LinkedIn. Which brings me to our next topic, networking. At a high level, I believe networking is one of those things that no one likes, but everyone should learn to be good at, similar to handling conflict. That said, there are ways to make networking work for you, which can be especially helpful if you, like me, struggle with social anxiety, particularly when meeting new people, even more so when you're in a position where you're making an ask. So back to LinkedIn. Really quick, I want to point out that I was able to design my profile banner very simply in Over, which is an app owned by GoDaddy and that is available on Apple and Android devices, as well as within the Chrome browser. They have different templates that you can use, and so I found one that spoke to my love of nature and my being a Sagittarius, and then applied my brand colors to it, and voila. Below that, you'll see my headline, and notice that there is a slight addendum of my pronouns, which I typically choose not to include in application materials. Beyond this, your LinkedIn should mirror whatever generalized one-page resume you've built for the function or industry you're pivoting into, with the one caveat that it should include any roles with relative recency that you feel give a recruiter a sense of who you are, or that would make it more likely for you to come up in a recruiter's search. For example, I don't include my work in hospitality on most of my resumes at this point, but I do list these roles on my LinkedIn because I have interest in potentially working in hospitality tech in the future, and the company I work for has brand recognition in the hospitality industry. Personally, I don't list bullets for roles like this. This is just a tip of the iceberg as regards LinkedIn optimization, but it is a critical piece to understand when pivoting. What I primarily want to focus on here, though, is messaging, which can be a tricky art on LinkedIn in particular, especially because of who you are allowed to message and because of character limits they impose when you are not connected to the person. Again, I'm not going to give a spiel about all the research required to get to the point of messaging someone or even drafting a more general networking message, although I am happy to take questions about that during the Q&A. But I want to discuss specifically doing these things when making a career pivot because often it takes something a little more. On the left is my first outreach to someone, and you can see I've already met this person. But even if I hadn't, my request at the end is specific, and I've used the prior sentence to communicate why I'm requesting to connect, because he and I had no mutual connections, and there is a notable focus on working together because he was seeking fellow community builders. He responded, "Hey Malcolm, how can I be helpful?" And then I responded on the right, and again was specific and to the point, although perhaps a bit more so this time. You'll notice that each of these is 3 sentences. I wouldn't advise writing much more than this to anyone, especially when you're hoping to meet with them face to face. As you might imagine, this was also pre-pandemic, and while within the scope of the pandemic, you might be inclined to ask for a Zoom call, please ask people for a phone call. Everyone is experiencing Zoom burnout to some degree, and they'll be more likely to respond positively to a phone call request. This particular exchange led to a scheduled meeting that never happened because this person ghosted me, which also happens, and that's another point I want to make. It is in your best interest to set and forget as much as you can in this process and to try to not take things personally, which I know is difficult. People get busy and miss calls or have a life emergency. You really just never know. That said, this person has continued to reinitiate contact and ghost me for the better part of the past year, and there are also people like that. These people I recommend you choose to invest very little energy into. As the quote goes, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Not all connections are made equal, and that is about them, not you. Moving on, within the tech space in particular, a place where people are most likely to show the truest versions of their professional selves is Slack. For those that are unfamiliar, Slack is a relatively popular messaging app which workplaces typically use for online chat communication. Slack calls these instances of its app a workspace. In recent years, these instances have also come to include ones not tied to specific places of work. I've noted some here that are popular within the communities I belong to. On the left are affinity-based ones, and on the right are domain and location-based ones. Within each of these are typically what Slack calls channels, which are effectively chat rooms for specific topics of conversation that you can involve yourself in to get to know the Slack community, as it's called. You can also DM an individual or group of individuals as well. Because these are professional digital spaces, they are typically channels dedicated to job seekers, as well as specific industry functions that you can build a network within through interaction. And these workspaces also tend to host events digitally for now, but also in person outside of a pandemic, where you can continue to network like at any other networking event. The advantage of these spaces is that they are typically a bit more inclusive and less formal, so the networking is both more casual, but often more effective. The energy is very friend of a friend. You can ease into conversation by simply reacting with emoji in the beginning if you want. And finally, people tend to come and go from these spaces, so you can call the shots in your engagement without too much pressure. And here are just two quick examples. On the left, you can see a DM exchange that someone initiated with me after a brief introduction I gave to the data science program cohort I'm a part of right now. Note the informality of the messaging. And then on the right, you can see me inside of a channel for Black people within the cohort, letting them know about this event right now, and that there are some emoji reactions and a threaded comment response. Quick plug for that program. If you are a part of any historically excluded communities, such as the LGBT+ community or the BIPOC community, and are interested in learning data science, this program is offered for free, and I can send you a referral link to their next cohort, which is accepting applications through mid-March and begins in mid-April. Finally, as regards networking, I want to discuss some email tips and tricks. Here will be more general, so forgive me if you already possess this knowledge. I personally find email to be the biggest black box in the job search or career pivot process overall, so I want to demystify it for anyone that feels the same way. In most situations, you'll be emailing someone you are either already connected to or that someone has introduced you to via email. You might also consider attempting to email a recruiter or hiring manager directly if you haven't heard anything from a company about a role you're interested in and have applied to, assuming you're in the job seeking phase of your pivot. My biggest recommendations are create a separate folder or label related to job seeking and career pivoting, maintaining your signature and grooming it as regularly as necessary, and finally installing Streak if you are using Gmail. I want to thank my colleague Simone for putting me onto the direct email strategy, which we'll discuss in a moment, and for putting me onto Streak, which is a Gmail plugin that allows you to see if anyone on an email chain has viewed an email, when they viewed it, and where they are if they are publicly sharing location data. You can see an example on the right. If you hover over the general timestamp, Streak will also show an exact timestamp of each open, and as you can see, this includes repeat opens. This is best applied for one-to-one emails since it does not disclose the identity of which party has opened the email at any time, including when emailing groups. The Streak example is actually tied to this email here. I was given someone's email on LinkedIn and was asked through that connection to email directly. The subpoint there is to always meet the connection you're seeking where they are. Personally, I prefer LinkedIn messaging to centralize my professional communications, but I don't want to let that get in the way of making a good connection, so I email when requested. The email is broken down into 3 parts: a brief introduction, a clarifying question about another request made by this connection in order to complete a referral, and finally, a direct ask about advice on how to apply. Typically, these are questions I might ask on a call, but when someone asks me to email them, I begin to assume that they are busy, so getting those questions answered via email is easier. As a general rule of thumb on networking, people want to help people, and most people enter into new roles through connections they perceive to be weaker. My colleague Nicole and I went to college together nearly a decade ago and have not spoken much since, but she readily helped me make this connection, likely simply because we shared that background. Ultimately, I was asking about a time-sensitive application, and this person was a bit too busy to assist in time, but I have now built a connection should I ever seek to apply to a role at a company they are at. Another general networking rule of thumb is to utilize all your connections. As you may well be aware, for this role, I actually spoke to 3 different people. Here's another quick example, but this one is a cold email where I attempted to directly email the hiring manager for a role I was interested in at Peloton. In this case, you can write a bit more substantially, like a mini version of a cover letter. As you can see, I've linked to my LinkedIn and the role I've applied to in the first sentence. Then I acknowledge that I'm reaching out directly while expressing my excitement about the role. Then I give a tailored version of my self-pitch, as we spoke about earlier, and wrap up by noting that I've attached my application materials, which I had already submitted. The result of this message was that I was returned a rejection later that day, but I do believe that to actually receive a rejection means you were onto something, especially the larger the company is. And frankly, one of the hardest parts of the job seeking or career pivoting process is the not knowing. So I took it as a win that I got my answer. Now, in the future, I can also use this email as a story point for future applications to Peloton. I would not use this method liberally, but you can typically assume that a person's email is either first name at company domain or first name.last name at company domain. Now, given the state of the world being mid-pandemic, I've made a large assumption that you as viewers may be unemployed and looking for the next thing, or at the very least, moving on from your current place of employment as you accomplish your career pivot. It's also my hope that I've communicated helpful advice that can be applied to either a functional career pivot, and by that I mean from customer support to product management, for example, as I've done, or an industry career pivot, such as ed tech to user research, as I've most recently done as well. That said, this section will be covering items specifically related to functional career pivoting within an organization. But I also hope that there are lessons in here for everyone about how to self-advocate, particularly within a workspace. When looking to enter into a new function internally, the first thing you should do is deliver on what you were hired to do. Certainly, many of us take jobs to get our foot in the door somewhere, but it's an unrealistic expectation to think you'll be able to complete any sort of movement without first living up to the promise of your initial employment. As you do that, you should also focus on showing up for other colleagues. Sit in on optional meetings, attend optional events, and engage with your peers. Where appropriate, do this outside of the context of work too. A number of my colleagues are on this call right now doing this exact thing, and it's not something I'll soon forget. You should also learn to celebrate your peers. There is a practice in the radical candor approach to feedback that encourages professionals to praise in public and criticize in private. My personal feeling on that is first that it's important to praise your colleagues privately too. Do it in rooms they're not in, particularly when management is present, because you would want someone to do the same for you. On a separate but related note, I think it should be considered appropriate to respectfully criticize in public, especially in the form of questioning authority. Essentially, I don't know very many people who appreciate a person that does one thing in public and another in private, so keep it a buck at all times. In life, you get what you give. Insofar as that is true, when you are a person that is comfortably and consistently performing the three items I've just mentioned, begin to lend a hand to colleagues specifically working in the function that you hope to enter into. There should be no task too small for you to help out with. In order to break into product, I helped with data cleaning, bug reporting, QA, and a number of other items well before I was required to do any of those things as part of my job. The trick here is to do it so well that it becomes an unofficial need for you to perform those functions in order to keep the business running. This strategy is more easily put into play the smaller the company is, but there are ways to do it at a company of any size. Once you've done this, you can start laying further groundwork to request a promotion, lateral or otherwise, and/or a title change. When you are in a position to specifically request a promotion or title change, you certainly will want to have done your research. You can do this as you increase your responsibilities, as the two often go hand in hand. First, you must research the company you already work for. While I am not encouraging you all to take on a level of ownership disproportionate to your role, you should put yourselves in the shoes of any stakeholder that could be the deciding factor in your mobility within an institution. At minimum, this is the team you would be leaving and the team you'd be joining, the person that would be your old manager and the person who'd be your new manager, and HR. Understand the business impact of your move and begin to frame for yourself how you would justify it. At the same time, you should begin researching the function itself internally, but also externally, especially when there is no current precedent for the function existing at your institution, which is more common the newer your target function is to the overall job market. This includes, but is not limited to, job descriptions and salaries, events, and training courses. Depending on what you know of the stakeholders you've identified, your next step is to begin communicating your desire to change functions to the person that you believe would be your biggest advocate and whom you trust to be the most honest with you. Based on this communication, you should understand whether the eventual pitch you need to make is centered around an immediate pivot or whether further actions would be necessary to make that pivot possible. This is when you'll now want to draft a proposal. A solid base for this proposal will include evidence of your past work that support a business need with your talent being the solution, a proposed new title and job description, especially if the function has not existed at this organization, a proposed salary, a transition plan, and if deemed necessary, a training plan that would enable this transition, including your commitment, especially financial, and any requested financial commitment from the organization with detailed notes about employee training pricing offers if necessary. Once this proposal has been drafted, go back to your advocate and any other trusted peers. Treat it like a script and solicit notes and feedback a few times as you refine. Once you've gotten it to the right place, you'll know. And at that time, it's about time to make the formal request. Out of the stakeholders you've identified, further identify the key decision makers and request a meeting with them. In that meeting request, share a brief agenda and attach the proposal. I've historically also shared an appendix showcasing my research, so you might find that helpful. Try to request a meeting somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks away so that you can ensure that they've had time to thoroughly get up to speed on your proposal and so that you have time to prepare. In the window between the request and the meeting, you should spend any available moment drilling responses to practice questions, i.e., treat this meeting like an interview. You should also spend time preparing yourself to not have any answer in that meeting, but to eventually, and sometimes in that meeting, have any possible answer. If they've hired the role before, they may tell you to wait for it to open up again. It may be requested that you take on additional training or responsibilities to ensure you're up to the task. They may just say yes, and they may also just say no. Prepare for anything. You are Beth Harmon playing Borgov, and I hope I have some Queen's Gambit stands in the audience for that one. In the spirit of preparing yourself for anything, I want to take some space to specifically focus on an outcome where you're not only told no, but given no support to eventually turn that no into a yes, by which I mean you receive no feedback, you are told it's not possible, and that there is no way to build any sort of plan to make it possible in the future. While I wish more companies were able to holistically support the professional development of their staff, the grim reality is that these institutions are few and far between, which is an entirely separate conversation. I have learned that you cannot change a company that reveals itself to be this way after you've taken the steps I've laid out, and so your only option will be to return the volley and start saying no to all those things you were doing that are outside of your job description. You've done them consistently in the past, so put them on your resume and start the process of networking your way out of your institution. Narrow your focus within your current place of employment to be laser focused on what is required within the scope of your actual role and job title, and mentally steel yourself for people to be frustrated, insinuate you are not a team player, or any such other negative response. I don't say these things to scare you away from pursuing your goals, but I say them from experience so that you can best prepare yourself for what it takes. The founder of the hospitality group I work for has a belief that companies should hire 51%ers. That is, he believes that 49% of any job is technical and thus teachable, while the remaining 51%, in this case being a hospitable person, is innate. What I've shared today is that 49%. The remaining 51% is confidence that cannot be bought or taught, but that hopefully you will have built by implementing some of this advice. The world is designed to gaslight you at every turn, and if you do not believe in yourself until the bitter end, people will see that and exploit it. And if you're earlier on in your career, please also remember that the most important references you will have from any institution are more likely your own peers than management. As you experience the struggles that come from all of this, and there will be many, it is important that you find self-care strategies that work for you. If you think of yourself as an athlete or a touring artist that needs to be able to compete or perform at a moment's notice and regularly. In order to do this, you have to know when to give 120% versus when to give 100% versus when to give 50%. And more importantly than that, when to rest. I am easily the busiest person I know, and what I try to communicate to everyone that asks how I do it all is that I am able to do so only as a result of practicing self-care and being gracious with myself. Those things come first and are not a response to burnout. You must be proactive in this sense and not reactive, because ultimately no one, especially an organization, will take care of you like you take care of you. One of the things that enables me to practice self-care successfully is maintaining a schedule. I was unemployed from the beginning of February through the end of September last year, but was busier than I was when I was working a full-time job prior. This is a sample week in my calendar. A few notes on what's included that have helped me. 1, the first thing in my calendar every morning is some form of exercise. I prefer running on the treadmill, but I'm no pandemic gym rat. So while it says gym, I was either learning to run outside again for the first time in years, or I was doing an indoor HIIT workout, which you can ask my roommate about. Then over breakfast, I would start my day by journaling, reading news, and checking on my email before a brief morning break. Not naturally a morning person, but sticking to this routine got my brain working and allowed me to maximize my productivity. Which I also want to say is just not something that is necessarily laudable, especially as we all work to just survive in this pandemic. The large yellow boxes were for applying to jobs, the large green boxes were for studying web development, and the blue boxes, for the most part, were either meetings or social engagements. Many of these are recurring, such as the Monday admin sync up for the BIPOC network I started for my college over the summer, and the team sync on Sunday afternoons for the social good consumer app I've been working on and I'm hopefully launching this weekend. Further still, I meet with my Dungeons and Dragons group on Friday nights. And so to the point, it is important for me to regularly schedule self-care by way of social interaction. Finally, if you look closely, I want to point out that this week includes my first interview at User Interviews on Wednesday. An important note on all of this, though, is that outside of interviews or meetings, everything else in my calendar is subject to change. If I don't feel like working out one day, guess what I'm not doing? If I'm exhausted and burnt out from meetings, even most of my social plans are truthfully open to being canceled. And I'm an extrovert saying all of this. You have to prioritize yourself at all costs, because if you don't, you'll pay the cost elsewhere, believe me. If you've flown in an airplane and have seen the safety demonstrations, then you know that you have to put your mask on first before helping anyone else, and that's on we're in a pandemic. And that's all I have for you today. There are a slew of other things I'm happy to share about accountability, goal setting, storytelling, and handling rejection. So if you'd like to connect, my LinkedIn URL is there. And if you're curious about the work I'm doing in user research over at User Interviews, my email is there for you. On the right is a QR code you can scan to take you to a short feedback form for this presentation. And I would very much so appreciate any you have to give, as it'll help me help other people. Last but not least, thank you to all of you for vibing with me today, especially my colleagues and friends on the call supporting me. And that's one last tip. Always show your friends love. I got a really big team and I wouldn't be here without them. And thank you to the other speakers for sharing your knowledge, and to the You Got This organizers, Katie, Kevin, Markella, and Amy, and to our hosts, Cassidy and Joe. It's so critical to have accessible spaces to have these conversations. And so I'm grateful that you've created a more inclusive type of conference for all of us to learn. And now I think there should be time for a brief Q&A.